As stated previously, the rebel slaves ended up fleeing when faced with the state militia. Federal troops later arrived, and in the process the rebellion was quickly quelled. In fact, while there were only 55 casualties or so among the white populace, African Americans suffered close to 200 casualties, due more to the fact of reprisal attacks by plantation owners against both free and enslaved African Americans, sometimes as far as a state away, who were suspected of having any kind of involvement in Nat Turner's rebellion. Now, Virginia actually nearly abolished slavery purely out of terror at the prospect of more slave revolts. However, the economic benefits of slavery eventually led Virginia down a different path, which was simply a more brutal oppression of both enslaved and free African Americans, who were almost constantly regarded as suspected slave rebels. Now, Turner himself was eventually apprehended and was hanged for his leading of the rebellion. Now, the next, of course, is the Compromise of 1850. So, getting back to our issue with the Mexican-American War, California is eventually, it was decided, would join as a free state. Arizona, which then included parts of Nevada as well as almost the entirety of New Mexico, entered as a slave state, as did Texas. Utah and Colorado, however, were allowed to choose whether to allow slavery or not. Another detail of the Compromise of 1850 is that the slave trade would be banned in the District of Columbia, but not slavery itself. In other words, if you went to D.C. circa 1850, you would not necessarily be walking past a slave auction in the middle of D.C., but people in D.C. could still own slaves. The Compromise of 1850 also reinvigorated the Fugitive Slave Act. Then we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So 4 years later, in 1854, Congress decides that the new territories of Nebraska and Kansas that are coming into being will instead decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty, aka voting. In other words, in Kansas, they would hold an election of sorts, electing a new state government and determining whether or not they would be a free state or a slave state. Alright, sounds simple enough. Leave it up to the people. Let the people decide. Well, this leads into a rather interesting episode in our nation's history, known as Bleeding Kansas. So what happens? Well, both abolitionist and pro-slavery organizations actually sent settlers. They encouraged people from their respective states to emigrate to Kansas for one purpose and one purpose only: swaying the election. So you had a number of free soilers, as they were called, mostly men from the north, who were heading out to Kansas in order to make sure it became a free state. Some of these men were abolitionists who opposed slavery on moral grounds. Others were farmers who simply didn't want to have to compete with slave labor and the large plantations. On the other end, many slave owners also went west to Kansas, hoping to make sure Kansas joined the ranks of the pro-slave states. Now, a group of individuals known as border ruffians, as they were sometimes called, were Missourians who, during the election, crossed the border into Kansas and illegally voted. The result of this was to create a pro-slavery government, which eventually was elected and took up position in the town of Shawnee Mission. Residents of Kansas, however, who were anti-slavery, ended up refusing to accept the pro-slavery legislature, supported by the Missouri border ruffians, and instead set up a rival government in Topeka. Needless to say, violence eventually erupted between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery governments of Kansas. Pro-slavery forces attacked the town of Lawrence, burning much of it to the ground. In another episode known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, John Brown, an individual persuaded by an intense religious devotion that slavery was a severe moral evil, ended up taking the fight to several slavery-supporting forces when he attacked the area, and him and those who were with him ended up hacking the pro-slavery supporters to death with swords. Now, this leads into our next page, which is John Brown's raid. So John Brown ended up, in his attempt to spark a slave revolt, he wanted to gain arms for these slaves. So he assaulted a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was captured by the soldiers there, and he was convicted of treason and executed on December 2nd, 1859. His last words were, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood." Now, at his demise, it is said church bells rang all over New England. In much of the North, he was regarded as a martyr. Hence, examining for one primary source this other document here for a town meeting, it says, "Meeting in the town hall, Friday, December 2nd. John Brown, the heroic apostle of freedom, suffers martyrdom on a Virginia gallows today. The church bells in Ravenna will be tolled from 1 to 2 o'clock p.m., that being the supposed hour of execution, the hour during which the spirit of the murdered martyr will wing its flight to the bosom of its murdered, crucified Savior. At 7 o'clock this Friday evening, a meeting will be held at the town hall and will be addressed by O.P. Brown and perhaps by others. The village clergyman will be present, and the meeting will be opened and closed with prayer. The ladies and gentlemen of Ravenna, who hate oppression and all its bloody, revengeful, savage barbarities, and whose sympathies with the devoted martyrs of liberty are invited to be present. Friday morning, December 2nd, 1859. So, John Brown's raid was polarizing, there can be no doubt. While many in the South regarded him as a traitor and a rebel, many in the North regarded him as a martyr to the cause of freedom and of liberty. However, things were about to get more intense. We're about to raise the stakes. With the Dred Scott decision and the famous election of Abraham Lincoln, we begin to arrive at a stage where it is no longer a question of where slavery will and will not be legal within the Union, but whether slavery will be entirely legal or entirely illegal within the Union. And this is where we start to reach the point of no return, the point of civil war. So, blood in the Capitol. So, during a particular interesting session, the anti-slavery Republican Charles Sumner, which I spelled wrong, I'm going to apologize right there, insulted a Southern congressman, calling into question his honor during a speech on the evils of slavery in Bleeding, Kansas. A relative of this man, who was also a congressman, proceeded to beat Sumner over the head repeatedly with a ceremonial cane. Now, those of you who do not know, a ceremonial cane tends to be made of hardwood and features a large bauble at the end, a large head of the cane, which in many cases would weigh in excess of 1 pound, just the head alone. So this heavy little stick could be used to beat someone with quite severely. In fact, Sumner never quite spoke in a typical fashion again after the incident, and many associate his atypical speech with brain damage, many historians do, believing that he suffered some sort of concussion or other brain damage from being beat over the head with a cane. Now, Southern Democrats sent the assailant, the man who beat him, replacement canes, since his broke during the assault. That's how badly he beat Congressman Sumner, as a way of showing their support for him. Now, it's bad enough when we have congressmen bludgeoning each other on the floor of the Capitol building, But now things get intense with the Dred Scott decision. So what is this decision? In 1857 is when this comes before the Supreme Court. Now, Dred Scott himself was a slave whose owners had taken him from a slave state to a free state and then back again. He sued upon the death of one of his owners, arguing, who was the gentleman, and when his wife came over his widow, he filed a lawsuit saying that since he had lived in a free state where slavery was illegal for a length of years, he was by right a free man. The case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court delivered several crushing rulings. First, they argued that since Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen, he could not file a lawsuit. Secondly, he was not a person, he was property. Thirdly, since the government cannot deprive an individual of their property without due process of law, it was in fact illegal for Congress or for the states to make laws prohibiting slavery anywhere in the Union. So instantly this raises tensions, because now this is an all-or-nothing game, so to speak. We are now at a point where it's no longer a question of, well, which states will be allowed to be free states, which states will be allowed to be slave states. But now we are either going to be one large slaveholding nation or one large free nation. But increasingly it's looking as if there can be no compromise with a position like Dred Scott. Either slavery will be legal or slavery will be illegal. And Dred Scott did give a massive victory to the pro-slavery forces, knocking down a litany of laws made to prevent slavery from entering certain territories. But by so doing, it only further enraged the North and set many more hearts and minds against the South. It's one thing to say the southern slave states can keep their slavery where they have it. It's another to say they're allowed to bring it up north. Now we arrive at this quote by Abraham Lincoln where he says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Now, this flies in the face of much of what you may have remembered about Lincoln from your elementary school days, where he's seen as one of the greatest abolitionist presidents. Now, Abraham Lincoln was himself personally of abolitionist sentiment, but this reveals his early strategy regarding the Union, and really his entire strategy regarding the Union. His goal is to preserve America first and foremost. Now, obviously, if he could do it by freeing all the slaves, he would. But he's also perfectly open to not freeing any slave, or to freeing some and leaving others be. However, you can imagine that when he said this, what most of the public focused on was the part where he said freeing all the slaves. So, the election of Abraham Lincoln, he's part of the Republican Party, which was a newly forming political party at the time, which was fiercely abolitionist, as opposed to the Democratic Party, which was divided between Northern Democrats that were less enthusiastic about slavery, and Southern Democrats for whom slavery was a prime issue. Abraham Lincoln's connections to the anti-slavery movement were enough that he was not even put on the ballot in most Southern states. In these Southern states, you could not even vote for Abraham Lincoln, even if you so desired. Nonetheless, without the support of a single Southern state, Abe Lincoln wins the election, and this instantly created a great tension for the South. Why? Well, one, they feared that with a Republican in power, they had an abolitionist in office. And two, that since that man had been elected without any support from the South, the notion became, well, the Union, the federal government, can do what it will without need of the support of the South at all. At this point, the South begins to figure, well, if we have no voice in the Republic, and the Republic is about to take away slavery, we need to form our own government immediately. It's at this point the Southern states move towards secession, for leaving the Union. And that is where we are at right now. So, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Have a pleasant break.